The severed head dripped blood onto the cobblestones. A man held it high for the crowd to see, not in horror, but in triumph. The executioner's assistant displayed it like a trophy, turning it slowly so everyone in the Place de la Révolution could witness. This was January 21st, 1793. The head belongs to Louis XVI, King of France by the grace of God, now simply Citizen Louis Capet, convicted of treason by a revolutionary tribunal and executed by the machine that had become the revolution's most famous symbol, the guillotine. In the crowd, some wept, some cheered, some stood in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. For 1,000 years, France had been ruled by kings who claimed divine sanction for their power, whose persons were sacred, whose authority descended from God through an unbroken chain of anointed monarchs. And now, in a single swift drop of a blade, that entire cosmology had been shattered. The death of the king was not murder. It was not regicide in the traditional sense. It was something new, popular sovereignty made manifest. The people had declared themselves the source of political authority. The king was simply a citizen who had betrayed the nation. His execution was not sacrilege, but justice. The revolution was not restoring an old order or reforming a broken system. It was creating a new world from scratch, writing new rules, imagining new possibilities. This moment, the king's head separated from his body, the divine right of kings literally severed, marks a rupture in human history as significant as any before or since. The worlds before 1789 and the world after are different in fundamental ways, not just in France, but everywhere. The ideas unleashed during the decade of revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, popular sovereignty, human rights, the nation, spread across the globe and never stopped spreading. We live inside the world the French Revolution created. Before we begin this journey through the revolution that remade humanity, a gentle note. If these evening explorations help you understand the world you've inherited, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps others discover these stories. And we're always curious about your reflections. Let us know in the comments which moment of the revolution resonates most with you, or which other transformative period you'd like us to explore. Now, as the day releases its hold and the quieter hours approach, let us travel back to 1789, to a kingdom on the verge of collapse, to a society that seemed permanent and eternal until suddenly it wasn't. We will witness how a financial crisis became a political revolution, how a political revolution became a social transformation, how a social transformation became a terror, and how that terror paradoxically gave birth to the modern world. This is not a story of heroes and villains, though it has both. It is not a story of inevitability, though afterward it seemed inevitable. It is a story of ordinary people making choices in extraordinary circumstances, of ideas gaining power, of events spiraling beyond anyone's control, of a decade when everything seemed possible and everything was at stake. This is the bedtime history of how the French Revolution changed humanity forever. But first, we must understand the world it destroyed, a world of kings and priests and nobles, of rigid hierarchies and ancient privileges, of a social order that seemed as natural and unchangeable as the seasons. That world was dying. The revolution would be its executioner and its gravedigger. France in 1788 was the most powerful kingdom in Europe and also the most bankrupt. These two facts were intimately connected. For over a century, French kings had spent lavishly on wars, on palaces, on the elaborate rituals of absolute monarchy. They had borrowed to finance their ambitions, always assuming that future revenues would cover current debts. But the future had arrived, and the debts had compounded beyond what the kingdom could sustain. Louis XVI was not a tyrant in the traditional sense. He was, in fact, painfully indecisive, well-meaning but weak, more interested in locksmithing and hunting than in governing. He had inherited a fiscal crisis from his grandfather, Louis XV, and had spent his reign lurching from one failed reform attempt to another. His finance ministers, Turgot, Necker, Cologne, had all proposed variations of the same solution: tax the nobles and clergy who had traditionally been exempt. All had been blocked by the privileged orders who refused to surrender their advantages. By 1788, the crisis was existential. The royal government was spending twice what it collected in revenue. Interest on the debt consumed half the budget. The usual expedients, more borrowing, selling offices, devaluing the currency, had been exhausted. Something had to give. The society this government ruled was structured by orders, the three estates. The first estate was the clergy, perhaps 130,000 people, owning about 10% of the land, paying almost no taxes. The second estate was the nobility, perhaps 400,000 people, owning another 25% of the land, also largely tax-exempt. The third estate was everyone else, 26 million people, from wealthy bankers and lawyers to urban artisans to landless peasants. They paid nearly all the taxes and held almost no political power. This structure had persisted for centuries. It seemed as natural and inevitable as the movement of the sun across the sky. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. The peasants, who made up 80% of the population, lived lives of grinding poverty punctuated by periodic starvation. They paid taxes to the king, tithes to the church, feudal dues to their lords. When harvests failed, as they did with increasing frequency in the 1780s, they starved while the grain they had grown as feudal obligations sat in noble warehouses. The resentment was ancient and deep. The urban workers, artisans, laborers, the sans-culottes who would become the revolution's shock troops, faced different pressures. The price of bread had risen faster than wages for decades. A bad harvest could mean that half their income went to bread alone, leaving almost nothing for rent or other necessities. They lived perpetually on the edge of riot, waiting for the next shortage to push them over. But the most destabilizing group was the bourgeoisie, wealthy commoners who had been enriched by commerce and finance, but who remained excluded from political power by an aristocratic system that valued birth over merit. They had the money to buy noble titles and offices, but they resented having to do so. They read Enlightenment philosophy, Voltaire mocking religious superstition, Rousseau arguing that legitimate government required popular consent, Montesquieu advocating for separation of powers. These ideas were not revolutionary yet. Most educated people accepted that monarchy was natural, that social hierarchy was necessary, that reform meant improving the existing system rather than replacing it. But the ideas created a vocabulary for criticism, a way of thinking about politics that emphasized reason rather than tradition, merit rather than birth, natural rights rather than hereditary privileges. The crisis came to a head in 1788. Cologne, the finance minister, proposed a comprehensive reform package that would have taxed noble land and created provincial assemblies with real power. The nobles blocked it. Louis XVI, desperate, called an assembly of notables, leading nobles and clergy, to approve the reforms. They refused. They said only the Estates General, a representative body that had not met since 1614, could approve such sweeping changes. Louis was trapped. He needed the reforms to avoid bankruptcy, but the privileged orders would not approve them. So in August 1788, he announced that the Estates General would meet in May 1789. The decision seemed routine. A traditional body would address a fiscal crisis through traditional means. Instead, it opened Pandora's box. Because once you called the Estates General, you had to decide how it would vote. Would each estate vote separately, giving the clergy and nobility a permanent 2-to-1 advantage? Or would all deputies vote together, giving the third estate's larger numbers the power to outvote the privileged orders? This technical question about voting procedures became the hinge on which the old world turned, because embedded in it was a deeper question. What is the basis of political authority? Is it tradition, privilege, divine sanction? Or is it numbers, popular will, consent? The Third Estate began organizing. Pamphlets proliferated, over 1,000 in the 6 months before the Estates General convened.
The most famous, Emmanuel C.S.'s What is the Third Estate, answered its own question with revolutionary simplicity. Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it demand? To become something.
This was new. This was dangerous. This was the assertion that political power should derive from the nation, understood as the people, rather than from tradition or divine right. It was the seed of popular sovereignty, still germinating, not yet fully revolutionary. But it would grow. The winter of 1788-89 was brutal. Harvests had failed, bread prices soared, rural France was starving. Urban France was rioting, and into this combustible situation came the elections for the Estates General, the first national elections in over a century, creating political expectations and mobilization at precisely the moment when economic desperation was reaching its peak. The Third Estate elected mostly lawyers and other professional men. The clergy elected many parish priests who resented their own church's hierarchy. Even the nobility elected some reformers who sympathized with change. The mood was not yet revolutionary. People wanted reform, not rupture. They believed the king would lead, that problems could be solved through cooperation and reason. The Estates General convened at Versailles on May 5, 1789. The king's speech was brief and uninspiring, focused entirely on finances. The deputies of the Third Estate, dressed in plain black as protocol required, while nobles were silk and plumed hats, sat in the vast hall and waited for something meaningful to happen. Instead, they got procedural deadlock. Would the estates meet separately or together? Would they vote by order or by head? The king refused to decide. The nobles insisted on separate meetings. The Third Estate refused to proceed unless all three orders met together. For 6 weeks, nothing happened except argument about procedure. But in that procedural deadlock, something was stirring. The Third Estate deputies began to radicalize. If the king would not lead, if the nobles would not compromise, then perhaps the Third Estate would have to act alone. Perhaps they represented the nation. Perhaps they had the authority to proceed without waiting for permission. On June 17th, they made the leap. The Third Estate, by itself, declared itself the National Assembly. They claimed to represent the nation. They invited the other orders to join them, but made clear they would proceed without them if necessary. This was revolutionary in the literal sense, a complete overturning of political authority. The king had not called a National Assembly. The National Assembly had called itself into existence. 3 days later, finding their meeting hall locked, supposedly for renovations, though they suspected the king was trying to prevent them from meeting, the deputies gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they swore the tennis court oath. They would not disperse until they had given France a constitution. This was the moment. This was when reform became revolution. A constitution meant written law would replace royal will as the basis of government. It meant the nation, not the king, was sovereign. It meant everything was about to change.
Louis XVI, indecisive as always, first ordered the three estates to meet separately, then reversed himself and told the clergy and nobility to join the National Assembly. He seemed to be accepting the revolution, but he was also moving troops toward Paris and Versailles. Were the troops there to protect the assembly or to disperse it? No one was sure, including probably the king himself. Paris did not wait to find out. On July 14, 1789, crowds stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison, a symbol of arbitrary power. They were looking for weapons, fearing that the king's troops would attack. The governor of the fortress tried to negotiate, then fired on the crowd. The crowd stormed the walls, captured the fortress, killed the governor and several guards, and paraded their severed heads through the streets on pikes. The symbolism was perfect, even if the strategic importance was minimal. The Bastille held only 7 prisoners, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and 1 aristocrat imprisoned at his family's request. But it represented royal despotism. Its fall represented popular power. The revolution had its founding myth, its sacred date, its moment of no return. Louis XVI, informed of the events, reportedly asked, "Is this a revolt?" His courtier answered, "No, sire, it is a revolution." The world of 1788, of divine right monarchy, of rigid social orders, of unquestioned privilege, was dying. What would replace it, no one yet knew. But in Paris, in the provinces, across France, people were about to find out that when you tear down an old world, building a new one is far more difficult than it seems. And the violence required to destroy the old would prove impossible to control once unleashed. As you settle toward sleep tonight, consider that moment when the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. It seems like mere words, a procedural maneuver, but it was the assertion of a new principle, that political authority comes from below, from the people, not from above, from God and tradition. Everything that followed, the rights of man, the constitutions, the republic, the terror, the transformations that spread across the world, all flowed from that assertion. The deputies who swore the tennis court oath did not know where their oath would lead. They did not foresee the king's execution or the terror or Napoleon's empire. They thought they were reforming France, not remaking humanity. But ideas once unleashed take on lives of their own. Revolutions once started follow their own logic. In our next chapter, we will watch as the National Assembly tries to create a new France on Enlightenment principles, a constitutional monarchy with rights and representation and reason. We will see the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, one of history's most influential documents. We will witness the king's flight and capture, the radicalization that followed, the slide toward republic and regicide. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, rest with the knowledge that the world was once organized completely differently than it is now, that change is possible, that structures that seem eternal are human creations and can be unmade. The revolution proved that. For better and worse, it proved that. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the new world begins.
August 4th, 1789. The National Assembly met at night, an emergency session called to address the chaos spreading across France. In the countryside, something called the Great Fear had seized the peasantry. Rumors spread that brigands were coming to destroy the harvest, that aristocrats were plotting revenge for the Bastille. In response, peasants attacked chateaux, burned feudal records, refused to pay dues. The old order was dissolving not through legislation, but through spontaneous popular action. The assembly debated how to restore order. Then something extraordinary happened. The Vicomte de Noailles, a liberal nobleman, stood and proposed that the assembly abolish feudal privileges entirely. Other nobles followed, caught up in the moment's emotion, each trying to outdo the others in sacrificing their ancient rights. The hunting privileges? Abolished. The exclusive right to maintain pigeon coops? Renounced. The special taxes? Surrendered. Serfdom? Ended. The session lasted until 2 in the morning. When it ended, the feudal structure of French society had been dismantled. 1,000 years of accumulated privilege had been voted away in a single night. The deputies wept and embraced, believing they had just created heaven on earth. One called it a night to remember for all the centuries. Another said the assembly had regenerated France. The morning brought sobriety. The decrees were written down, and the nobles discovered they had been more generous in midnight enthusiasm than they intended to be in daylight reality. Many tried to walk back their concessions. The assembly spent weeks clarifying what had actually been abolished, the symbolic aspects of feudalism, versus what would be gradually phased out with compensation, the property aspects. But the principle had been established. Privilege based on birth was no longer legitimate. Only rights based on citizenship would remain. 3 weeks later, on August 26th, the Assembly approved the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. 17 articles, fewer than 900 words in the original French. It would become one of the most influential documents in human history, second only to the American Declaration of Independence in shaping global conceptions of rights and liberty. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights, it began. Not Frenchmen, men, universally. The rights it proclaimed were not granted by kings or earned through birth, but inherent in being human. Liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression, these were natural rights that governments existed to protect, not privileges that authority bestowed.
Article 3 was revolutionary in the purest sense. The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation, not in the king, not in God's anointed representative, in the nation, meaning the people collectively. This was the theoretical foundation for everything that would follow. The Declaration spoke of freedom of thought, of religion, of expression. It proclaimed equality before the law. It insisted that law must be the same for everyone, protecting and punishing without regard to status. It declared that taxation required consent, that arbitrary arrest was illegitimate, that accused persons were presumed innocent. These ideas were not entirely new. They drew heavily from Enlightenment philosophy and from the American Declarations of Rights, but proclaiming them in Europe's most powerful kingdom, in a society structured by hierarchy and privilege, gave them revolutionary force. The Declaration was not describing France as it existed, but imagining France as it should be, and in the gap between is and should be, revolution would unfold. The Assembly then turned to the immense work of writing a constitution. They debated for months about fundamental questions. Should France remain a monarchy or become a republic? Should the king have veto power over laws? Should voting rights be universal or restricted to property owners? Should France have one legislative chamber or two? The constitutional debates revealed the Assembly's internal divisions. On the right sat conservatives who wanted minimal change, a reformed monarchy with aristocratic influence. In the center sat moderates who wanted constitutional monarchy on the British model. On the left sat radicals who questioned whether monarchy was compatible with the Declaration's principles. But even the radicals were not yet Republicans. The king remained, if not sacred, at least necessary. France was too large for Republican governance, they believed. Monarchy could be made compatible with liberty through constitutional limits. Louis XVI could become a constitutional monarch, executing laws rather than making them, governing within limits set by the nation's representatives. The problem was Louis himself. He had never accepted the revolution. He approved the Declaration and the August decrees under duress, with Parisian crowds surrounding Versailles, making clear what would happen if he refused. When the Assembly moved to Paris in October 1789, forced by the Women's March on Versailles, the king came too, essentially a prisoner of the revolution he nominally led. Louis went through the motions. He appeared at revolutionary festivals, he wore the tricolor cockade, he signed decrees that stripped away his power. But privately, he wrote to other European monarchs describing the revolution as illegitimate, asking for help, planning escape. The Assembly, meanwhile, was remaking France from the ground up. They abolished the old provinces and created departments, rational administrative units drawn with geometric precision. They nationalized church property to pay the state's debts, selling it off to whoever could afford it. They required the clergy to swear loyalty to the nation, splitting the church between those who accepted the revolution and those who remained loyal to Rome. Each reform created new conflicts. The sale of church lands enriched the bourgeoisie who could buy it, while doing nothing for landless peasants. The constitutional oath split families and communities between juring priests who swore and non-juring priests who refused. The rational administrative system destroyed local identities and traditions. But the Assembly pressed forward, convinced that reason and will could reshape society. They created a new calendar, starting time itself over at year 1 of the Republic, though the Republic did not yet exist. They redesigned weights and measures, creating the metric system. They imagined that revolutionary transformation could extend to every aspect of life, that you could rationally redesign not just government, but culture, society, even how people measured and understood the world. The Constitution of 1791, when finally completed, created a constitutional monarchy with a unicameral legislature elected by active citizens, men who paid a certain amount in taxes.
This excluded about 3 million men from voting and all women from political rights entirely. The Declaration had proclaimed universal rights, but the Constitution revealed that men meant propertied men, that citizen was a category that could include or exclude. This contradiction between universal principles and limited practice would haunt the Revolution and all subsequent revolutionary movements. How could you proclaim equality while maintaining hierarchies? How could you declare rights universal while denying them to women, to the poor, to colonial subjects? The Revolution had unleashed ideas it could not control or limit. The Constitution's unveiling in September 1791 should have been the Revolution's culmination. The Assembly dissolved itself, believing its work complete. Elections were held for a new legislative assembly under constitutional rules. France would now be a modern nation, monarchy limited by law, rights protected, citizens represented. But the revolution was not over. It had only just begun. The problem was that revolutionary France was surrounded by hostile monarchies, terrified that French ideas would spread. Austria and Prussia threatened intervention. French émigrés, nobles who had fled the revolution, gathered on France's borders, plotting restoration. War seemed inevitable. Within France, political clubs had formed that operated outside the formal government structure. The Jacobins were the most organized, with hundreds of affiliated clubs across France. They were more radical than the constitutional monarchists, more suspicious of the king, more committed to popular sovereignty. They had supported the Constitution, but watched nervously as Louis proved unable or unwilling to govern within its limits. The king himself resolved the crisis through catastrophic miscalculation. On June 20, 1791, Louis and his family attempted to flee France, dressed in disguise, heading for the Austrian border. They made it to Varennes, about 30 miles from escape, before being recognized and arrested. The flight destroyed whatever trust remained. Louis had publicly accepted the Constitution while privately betraying it. His capture made clear what many had suspected. He was not a constitutional monarch accepting limits, but a prisoner waiting for foreign armies to restore his power. The Assembly, dominated by moderates desperate to preserve constitutional monarchy, concocted a fiction. The king had not fled, but had been kidnapped. They suspended him briefly, then restored him when he agreed to accept the Constitution again. But no one believed the fiction. The revolution had been moving left, toward republic, toward popular power, toward the logic of the Declaration taken to its conclusion.
War accelerated everything. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria. The stated reason was to defend the revolution against foreign threats. The real reasons were more complex. Radicals believed war would expose traitors and force revolutionary commitment, while moderates hoped military success would unite the nation and stabilize the government. Instead, the war was an immediate disaster. French armies, their officer corps depleted by émigré flight, suffered defeats. Enemy forces advanced on Paris. The revolution seemed on the verge of military collapse. The crisis produced radicalization. If France was losing, it must be because of internal traitors, the king who corresponded with Austria, the nobles who had never accepted the revolution, the non-juring priests who undermined revolutionary loyalty. The Assembly declared the nation in danger. Volunteers flooded to Paris from the provinces, singing the Marseillaise, ready to defend the revolution. On August 10, 1792, the Parisian sections, neighborhood assemblies of sans-culottes, organized an insurrection. They attacked the Tuileries Palace where the king lived. The Swiss guards defending it were massacred. Louis and his family fled to the Legislative Assembly for protection, but the Assembly, facing the armed crowd, had no choice. They suspended the king and called for elections to a national convention that would write a new constitution.
The monarchy, for all practical purposes, was finished. The question now was what would replace it, and what to do with the king who had become the revolution's prisoner. The September massacres intervened before the convention could meet. With enemy armies approaching Paris, panic spread that counter-revolutionaries imprisoned in the city would break out and attack from behind. For 3 days in early September, mobs invaded the prisons and conducted summary executions. Over 1,000 prisoners died, some genuine political opponents of the revolution, many common criminals, some simply unlucky. The massacres revealed something dark gestating within the revolution. Violence was no longer controlled, directed, purposeful. It was becoming spontaneous, popular, a crowd's immediate will substituting for legal process. The revolution had proclaimed the rule of law, but whose law? What happened when popular sovereignty and legal procedure conflicted? The National Convention met for the first time on September 21, 1792. Its first act was to abolish the monarchy. Its second was to declare France a republic. No debate, no ceremony. The republic simply came into existence by decree. September 21st became day 1 of year 1. The calendar was reset. Time began again. But the republic was born into crisis. The war continued. Internal divisions deepened. The economy was collapsing. And sitting in a prison cell was Louis Capet, former king, now prisoner, waiting to discover whether the revolution that had stripped him of power would now take his life.
The trial of Louis XVI consumed the convention from November 1792 through January 1793. The charges were clear. He had conspired with France's enemies, had tried to flee, had betrayed the nation. The evidence was overwhelming. His correspondence with Austria had been discovered, his flight attempt documented. But the trial was not really about his guilt. It was about the revolution's nature. What did it mean to execute a king? Not just any king, the sacred person, God's anointed. For centuries, touching the king's person had been sacrilege. Regicide was not just murder, but a cosmic crime against the divine order. The revolutionaries had to reframe everything. Louis was not the king. The monarchy was abolished. He was citizen capet, a traitor to the nation. His execution would not be regicide, but justice. The sacred had to become profane. The king had to become simply a man, and a guilty one. The convention voted. On guilt, unanimous. On punishment, 361 for death, 360 against. Some proposing exile or imprisonment, some arguing execution but delayed. On whether to appeal to the people, defeated. On whether to delay execution, defeated by 5 votes. Louis XVI was executed on January 21, 1793. He died with dignity, trying to speak to the crowd but drowned out by drums. The blade fell. The executioner's assistant held up the severed head. Some in the crowd cheered. Others wept. Some dipped handkerchiefs in the blood as souvenirs, sacred relics of a new faith. Europe was horrified. Britain, Spain, the Netherlands joined Austria and Prussia in war against France. Revolutionary France now faced a coalition of monarchies determined to crush the Republic. The revolution had crossed a line from which there was no return. And internally, the dynamics shifted irrevocably. If you could kill the king, what couldn't you do? If popular sovereignty was absolute, what limits existed? If emergency required extraordinary measures, who decided when emergency ended? The logic of the terror was already implicit in the logic of the Republic. It would take only months to make it explicit. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the distance traveled in less than 4 years, from a fiscal crisis requiring nobles to pay taxes to the execution of the king, from reform to revolution to republic to regicide. Each step seemed necessary, even inevitable given the step before, but none of it was inevitable looking forward, only backward. The Declaration of the Rights of Man proclaimed universal principles, but universal principles, taken seriously, are radically destabilizing. If all men are born free and equal, why should some be nobles and others peasants? If sovereignty resides in the nation, why should a king reign? If people have the right to resistance against oppression, when does resistance become legitimate? These questions had no moderate answers. The revolution's internal logic pushed toward ever more radical conclusions.
The moderates kept trying to stop, to stabilize, to say this far and no further. But the radicals understood that you could not half embrace the Declaration's principles. Either rights were universal or they were privileges. Either the people were sovereign or they were subjects. There was no middle ground. In our next chapter, we enter the Terror, the year when the revolution consumed itself, when virtue became synonymous with violence, when the same principles that had proclaimed rights led to mass executions. We will try to understand how people who genuinely believed in liberty could create dictatorship, how those who proclaimed fraternity could send thousands to the guillotine, how reason could produce madness. But that is tomorrow's darkness. Tonight, rest with the knowledge that ideas matter, that principles have consequences, that declaring rights changes the world, even when, especially when, the world resists the change. Sleep well. The Republic is o'er, the terror approaches.
Maximilien Robespierre was not supposed to be a revolutionary. He was supposed to be a provincial lawyer in Arras, drafting contracts and arguing property disputes, living a comfortable bourgeois life. He was small, fastidious, dressed impeccably, spoke in a high-pitched voice that colleagues found grating. He had no charisma in the conventional sense, no commanding presence. What he had was absolute conviction. He believed in virtue, not as an abstract concept, but as a political program. The Republic, he argued, could survive only if its citizens were virtuous, meaning devoted to the common good above private interest, willing to sacrifice everything for the nation, pure in motive and incorruptible in action. This sounds noble until you realize what it meant in practice. Anyone who disagreed with Robespierre's vision of virtue was, by definition, corrupt, and corruption in a republic was treason, and treason deserved death. This was the logic that produced the Terror, the 14-month period from mid-1793 to mid-1794, when the revolution turned on itself and devoured thousands in the name of saving the republic. It was not an aberration. It was not madness. It was revolutionary logic taken to its conclusion. If the Republic embodied the general will, and if opposing the Republic was opposing the people, then eliminating opposition was defending democracy. The guillotine became the instrument of popular sovereignty. Let us understand how this happened, because the Terror was not inevitable. It emerged from specific circumstances and specific choices, and those circumstances and choices reveal something profound about revolutionary violence and the dangers of political absolutism dressed in the language of virtue. The Republic in early 1793 faced existential threats on every front. Foreign armies pressed France's borders. The Vendée region in western France erupted in counter-revolutionary rebellion, peasants rising against Republican conscription and attacks on the church. Food shortages produced riots in Paris. The currency was collapsing. Splits within the convention between the Girondins, or moderates, and the Montagnards, or mountain, radicals, paralyzed governance. The convention responded by creating emergency institutions. The Revolutionary Tribunal would try political crimes swiftly without normal legal protections. The Committee of Public Safety would coordinate defense and internal security, operating with near-dictatorial powers. Representatives on mission would be sent to the provinces with unlimited authority to requisition supplies and enforce revolutionary discipline. These emergency measures were supposed to be temporary. They became permanent features of government for over a year. Emergency became normal. Exception became rule. The institutions created to save the Republic became instruments of terror. The word terror itself was embraced openly. In September 1793, the convention declared terror the order of the day. This was not a secret policy or an unfortunate necessity they regretted. It was public doctrine. Bertrand Barrère declared, "Let us make terror the order of the day so that we need not practice it forever." The Terror was supposed to be temporary, a brief period of virtue enforced by violence, after which the Republic would be secure and could return to peaceful governance. It did not work out that way.
The first major victims were the Girondins, the moderate Republicans who had led France into war but who now questioned the radicals' methods. In June 1793, sans-culottes surrounded the convention demanding the Girondins' arrest. The convention, intimidated by armed crowds, expelled 29 Girondin deputies. Many fled to the provinces, some were captured and executed, others committed suicide. The principle of parliamentary immunity died with them. Then came the Queen. Marie Antoinette had been imprisoned since August 1792, separated from her children, living in increasing squalor. Her trial in October 1793 was a show trial in the purest sense, the verdict predetermined, the evidence partly fabricated. She was accused of everything from financial extravagance to sexual perversion to conspiring with Austria, the only charge with substantial truth. She faced her accusers with dignity that impressed even hostile observers. It made no difference. She was guillotined on October 16th. The machinery of terror accelerated. The Revolutionary Tribunal processed hundreds of cases. The standards of evidence dropped. Mere suspicion became sufficient. Association with suspects became criminal. The definition of counter-revolutionary expanded to include anyone who questioned the Committee of Public Safety's decisions. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, permitted arrest of anyone whose conduct, relationships, or spoken or written words marked them as enemies of the revolution. The vagueness was the point. When anyone could be suspect, everyone had to perform revolutionary enthusiasm constantly. You had to attend section meetings, volunteer for service, denounce counter-revolutionaries, speak the revolutionary language perfectly. Any slip could be fatal.
The provinces suffered terror more extensively than Paris. Representatives on mission arrived with guillotines and orders to purge unreliable elements. In Lyon, which had rebelled against the convention, thousands were executed, sometimes by guillotine, sometimes by cannon fire into crowds of bound prisoners, sometimes by drowning in the Rhone. The city itself was to be destroyed and renamed Liberated City. Only workers' homes would remain. Everything else would be demolished as punishment for counter-revolution. In Nantes, Jean-Baptiste Carrier conducted noyades, mass drownings. Prisoners were loaded onto boats with holes drilled in the holes, then sunk in the Loire. Estimates suggest between 2,000 and 5,000 people died this way. Carrier justified it as efficiency. The guillotine was too slow, shooting wasted ammunition, drowning was practical. He called it Republican baptism. In the Vendée, the convention's forces conducted what modern historians call genocide. The region's peasant rebellion was suppressed with systematic brutality. Entire villages were destroyed. Columns infernalis, infernal columns, swept through, killing indiscriminately. Women and children were massacred alongside rebel fighters. General Westermann reported to the committee, "There is no more Vendée. I have crushed the children under the feet of horses, massacred the women who will give birth to no more brigands. I do not have a prisoner to reproach me. I have exterminated all." Back in Paris, Robespierre consolidated power on the Committee of Public Safety. He was not a dictator in the traditional sense. He shared power with other committee members, particularly Saint-Just and Couthon. But he was the revolution's voice, its prophet, its high priest of virtue. His speeches during this period are remarkable documents. They are eloquent, philosophical, absolute in their moral certainty. He speaks of virtue constantly, virtue as the foundation of democracy, virtue as the only security against corruption, virtue as that which must be imposed by force if it cannot be achieved by persuasion. If virtue be the spring of a popular government in times of peace, the spring of that government during a revolution is virtue combined with terror, virtue without which terror is destructive, terror without which virtue is impotent. Terror is only justice prompt, severe, and inflexible. It is then an emanation of virtue. Read that carefully. Terror is an emanation of virtue. Violence is moralized, sanctified, made into a duty. This is how good people commit atrocities, by convincing themselves that cruelty is kindness, that killing is saving, that their violence serves a higher purpose. Robespierre genuinely believed this. He was not a sadist. He took no pleasure in the executions. He lived simply, refused bribes, remained personally incorruptible. He sacrificed friendships and political alliances when they conflicted with his vision of virtue.
He was, in his own understanding, saving the Republic from its enemies, foreign and domestic, visible and hidden. This made him more dangerous than any cynical tyrant, because he could not compromise. Compromise implied accepting corruption. He could not admit error. Error implied lack of virtue. He could not tolerate opposition. Opposition implied counter-revolutionary intent. His certainty was absolute, and absolute certainty wielding absolute power is a recipe for mass death.
The cultural revolution that accompanied the political terror tried to remake French society completely. Christianity was attacked as superstition. Churches were converted to temples of reason. Priests were forced to marry or renounce their vows. The Christian calendar was replaced with the revolutionary one. 10-day weeks, months named for natural phenomena, no Sundays or saints' days. The cult of the Supreme Being was established as a deist alternative to Catholicism. Robespierre organized a massive festival in June 1794, celebrating this new civic religion. He appeared in his role as high priest, speaking of virtue and the immortal soul. The crowd was vast, the staging spectacular. It was also the beginning of his end. The display revealed his megalomania too nakedly. His colleagues on the committee grew nervous. If he could organize such cults, what prevented him from making himself dictator? The de-Christianization campaign alienated millions of French people for whom religion remained central to identity and community. The sans-culottes embraced it enthusiastically, ransacking churches and harassing priests, but peasants and many workers resented the assault on their faith. The revolution was creating enemies faster than it could eliminate them. By spring 1794, the terror was consuming its own children. The Hébertists, ultra-radicals who wanted even more extreme measures, were guillotined in March for being too extreme. The Dantonists, moderates who wanted to end the terror, were guillotined in April for being too moderate. Danton himself, the great orator who had helped create the terror, went to the guillotine pleading for mercy. "Show my head to the people," were reportedly his last words. "It is worth seeing." The logic was spiraling. If Hébert was too radical and Danton too moderate, what was the correct position? Only Robespierre's. Anyone who deviated in either direction was suspect. The space for political survival narrowed to a point. The Great Terror began in June 1794 with the Law of 22 Prioral. It simplified trial procedures even further. No witnesses needed, no defense lawyers allowed, only two possible verdicts, acquittal or death. The Revolutionary Tribunal became a pure killing machine. In 6 weeks, it executed 1,376 people, more than in the previous 14 months combined. The convention watched in horror as the terror accelerated. Anyone could be next. Robespierre's speeches grew more abstract and menacing. He spoke of hidden conspiracies and traitors within the government without naming names. This terrified his colleagues more than specific accusations would have. If you did not know who he suspected, you had to assume it might be you. The coup came on 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794, by the revolutionary calendar. It was not a popular uprising, but a conspiracy of convention deputies desperate to save their own lives. They coordinated carefully, knowing they would have one chance. When Robespierre tried to speak in the convention, they shouted him down, something that had never happened before. They voted his arrest. The Commune of Paris tried to organize resistance, but the sections did not mobilize. The sans-culottes were exhausted. They had seen too many of their own leaders guillotined. They did not rise for Robespierre. Robespierre and his closest allies were arrested that night. He tried to commit suicide, but only shattered his jaw with a pistol shot. The next day, bandaged and in agony, unable to speak, he was taken to the guillotine along with 21 others. The crowd that had cheered executions for over a year cheered again, but this time they were cheering the terror's end.
The Thermidorian reaction, as the period after Robespierre's fall is called, brought rapid de-escalation.
The Revolutionary Tribunal was reformed and then abolished. The Committee of Public Safety's powers were reduced. Imprisoned suspects were released. The law of 22 prairial was repealed. The guillotine, which had operated almost daily for 14 months, fell silent. The total death toll of the Terror is disputed. Perhaps 16,000 people were executed after trial by the Revolutionary Tribunal. Perhaps another 25,000 were executed summarily without trial. Perhaps 200,000 died in the Vendée and other internal wars. The numbers are uncertain. What is certain is that the revolution had consumed thousands of its own supporters along with its enemies. The men who died in the Terror were not all innocent. Many had genuinely conspired against the Republic, but many others died for thought crimes, for associations, for failing to perform revolutionary enthusiasm convincingly enough, for being denounced by neighbors settling personal scores. The Terror had been justified as necessary to save the Republic, but it had nearly destroyed the Republic by creating such fear that no one could speak honestly, such suspicion that no one could trust anyone, such violence that revolution became synonymous with mass death. The revolution that began by proclaiming rights ended by executing thousands without trial. How did this happen? How did liberty produce tyranny? How did fraternity produce mass denunciation? How did reason produce madness? The answers are uncomfortable. The Terror emerged from the revolution's highest principles. Popular sovereignty meant the people's will was absolute, but who spoke for the people? The convention said it did. Therefore, opposing the convention was opposing the people. The circle was closed. Democracy became dictatorship through the logic that the people's representatives embodied the people's will. The emergency was real. France was at war, invaded, facing rebellion, threatened with restoration. But emergency powers, once granted, are difficult to revoke. The institutions created to deal with crisis became permanent. The men who wielded emergency power became invested in maintaining it. Virtue is a dangerous foundation for politics, because virtue cannot compromise. Compromise is corruption. Virtue cannot admit error. Error is lack of virtue. Virtue cannot tolerate opposition. Opposition is vice. When politics becomes about virtue rather than interests, negotiation becomes impossible. Everything becomes absolute. Absolutism in the name of virtue is no less tyrannical than absolutism in the name of God or king. The revolution discovered these truths through blood. The lessons would echo through every subsequent revolution, that destroying an old order is easier than building a new one, that ideological purity produces violence, that emergency powers become permanent, that revolutionaries often become what they fought against.
As you settle towards sleep tonight, consider the tragedy of Robespierre and his colleagues. They were not evil men. They genuinely believed in the Republic, in rights, in popular sovereignty. They sacrificed personal comfort and safety for their beliefs. They could not be bribed or corrupted, and they sent thousands to their deaths. Virtue without humility is tyranny. Conviction without doubt is fanaticism. Revolutionary principles without limits are recipes for terror. The same ideas that proclaimed human rights also justified mass executions. The revolution was not betrayed by the terror. The terror emerged from revolutionary logic itself. In our next chapter, we will see how Napoleon Bonaparte took this exhausted, traumatized France and transformed it again, stabilizing the revolution while also betraying it, spreading its principles across Europe through conquest, creating an empire that was both the revolution's heir and its grave. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, remember the victims of the terror, those who died as counter-revolutionaries and those who died as insufficiently revolutionary, those guilty of conspiring against the Republic and those guilty only of being suspected. Remember also the lesson that the road to mass death can be paved with genuine conviction, that cruelty can be committed in the name of virtue,
that the most dangerous tyrants are those who believe they serve a higher purpose. Rest now. The terror is over, but the revolution is not finished. It will take one more form, that of a general on horseback, bearing the revolution's principles in one hand and a sword in the other, remaking Europe and embedding revolutionary ideas so deeply that they could never be fully erased. Tomorrow we meet Napoleon. Tonight we mourn the republic of virtue that devoured itself. Sleep well. The guillotine is silent now. He was 26 years old, obscure, a junior artillery officer from Corsica with a thick accent and no connections. His name was Napoleone Buonaparte. He would later Gallicize it to Napoleon Bonaparte. In October 1795, the Directory that had replaced Robespierre's government faced a royalist uprising in Paris. They needed someone to suppress it. Someone recommended this Corsican artillery officer. He had guns placed strategically around the Tuileries Palace. When the royalist mob approached, he ordered grape shot fired directly into the crowd. Hundreds died. The uprising collapsed. Bonaparte called it a whiff of grape shot. He was promoted to general.
This was Napoleon's introduction to power. Violence, precision, results. Within 4 years, he would rule France. Within 15, he would rule most of Europe. And everywhere his armies went, they carried the revolution with them, not in its pure republican form, not as democracy or rights, but as rational administration, legal codes, meritocracy, the destruction of feudalism. Napoleon was the revolution's contradictory heir. He preserved many of its achievements while betraying its core principles. He spread Enlightenment reforms while building personal dictatorship. He was simultaneously the revolution's culmination and its gravedigger. Tonight we trace how the revolution that began by proclaiming popular sovereignty ended with an emperor on a throne. But more importantly, we trace how that emperor exported revolutionary principles across Europe so thoroughly that when his empire fell, the ideas remained, embedded in laws, institutions, and the imaginations of peoples who had glimpsed a world beyond the old regime. France in 1795 was exhausted. The terror had ended, but the trauma remained. The Directory that governed France was corrupt, unpopular, lurching from crisis to crisis. The economy was a disaster. Inflation had destroyed the currency. Food shortages persisted. The war against the European coalition continued, draining resources. But France was also discovering that it had created a new kind of military force. The revolutionary armies were not professional soldiers serving kings. They were citizens defending the nation, or at least that was the ideology. Conscription had created mass armies larger than anything Europe had seen. Revolutionary enthusiasm had replaced traditional discipline. Promotion by merit rather than birth had brought talented commanders to the fore. Napoleon was the supreme expression of this revolutionary meritocracy. He was not from the old nobility. He was not even from mainland France. He was from Corsica, barely French at all. But he was brilliant at warfare, not just tactics and strategy, but logistics and psychology and the grand theater of command. He understood that modern war was about morale and movement, about keeping soldiers fed and motivated, about striking where unexpected and moving faster than enemies could respond. His Italian campaign of 1796 through 97 made him famous. He took a ragged, unpaid, demoralized army and led it to spectacular victories against the Austrians. He fought battles at a pace that left enemies reeling. He negotiated treaties on his own authority. He sent looted art and gold back to Paris, making himself popular with the government and the people. He presented himself as the revolution's defender, spreading liberty to oppressed Italians, while also, conveniently, making himself wealthy and powerful.
The pattern was set. Napoleon would wrap himself in revolutionary rhetoric while pursuing personal ambition. He would speak of liberation while establishing French dominance. He would proclaim principles while caring primarily about power.
The revolution had created him, a man of talent rising through merit, commanding citizen armies, fighting for the nation. But he would remake the revolution in his own image. The coup of 18 Brumaire, November 9, 1799, was almost farcical. Napoleon had returned from a disastrous Egyptian campaign that he spun into propaganda victory. He conspired with 2 directors and various plotters to overthrow the Directory and establish a new government. The coup required intimidating the legislature into dissolving itself. Napoleon entered the Council of 500 to demand their cooperation. The deputies, many wearing togas in imitation of Roman republicans, shouted him down. Some called for his arrest, declaring him an outlaw. Napoleon's brother, Lucien, presiding over the session, saved him by summoning troops and lying that assassins had attacked Napoleon. The soldiers cleared the chamber. The remaining deputies, reassembled elsewhere and intimidated, voted to dissolve the Directory and create a consulate with Napoleon as first consul. It was a military coup disguised as constitutional transition. Democracy gave way to autocracy. The revolution that had executed a king for usurping popular sovereignty now submitted to a general who seized power by force. The justification was familiar. Emergency required strong leadership. Order required authority. The revolution's achievements required protection from chaos. Napoleon moved quickly to consolidate power. A plebiscite, voting yes or no on the new constitution, gave him apparent popular approval, though the vote was manipulated. As first consul, he had far more power than any single individual had held since the monarchy. But he maintained revolutionary forms. There were still legislative bodies, still elections, though he controlled who could run, still appeals to popular sovereignty, though the people's will was interpreted to mean whatever Napoleon wanted. The contradiction was embedded in Napoleon himself. He was a child of the revolution who despised democracy. He believed in careers open to talent, but established a new aristocracy of merit that soon became hereditary. He proclaimed liberty while censoring the press and exiling critics. He spoke of fraternity while waging endless wars. But he also stabilized France in ways the revolutionary governments had failed to achieve. He negotiated the Concordat with the Pope in 1801, restoring limited religious freedom and ending the schism between France and the Catholic Church. He created the Bank of France, stabilizing the currency. He reformed administration, creating the system of prefects that governed France efficiently. He commissioned monuments and public works that gave Paris grandeur. Most importantly, he codified the revolution's legal achievements in the Civil Code of 1804, later called the Napoleonic Code. It systematized French law, enshrining principles that the revolution had proclaimed: equality before the law, religious toleration, abolition of feudalism, protection of property rights, secular marriage and divorce. But the code also revealed Napoleon's conservatism. Women were subordinated to male authority. A wife could not work, control property, or enter contracts without her husband's permission. Workers' rights were limited. The code protected order and property more than liberty or equality. It was a revolutionary document filtered through authoritarian priorities. Still, it was revolutionary compared to the old regime, and it was portable. As French armies conquered Europe, they brought the code with them. Countries that adopted it, or had it imposed, gained a modern legal framework that persisted long after Napoleon's empire fell. The code still forms the basis of civil law across much of Europe and Latin America.
In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself emperor. The coronation at Notre Dame was staged with deliberate symbolism. The Pope was present to bless the event, but Napoleon placed the crown on his own head rather than receiving it from religious authority. He was claiming legitimacy from revolutionary principles, the people's will as expressed through the plebiscite that approved his imperial title, while establishing a new dynasty. The revolution that had abolished monarchy now had an emperor. The republic that had executed a king now had a ruler who claimed more power than Louis XVI had ever possessed. The cognitive dissonance was resolved through Napoleon's genius for propaganda. He presented himself not as a king, but as the revolution's protector, the nation's servant, the people's choice. The title of emperor came not from God, but from popular acclaim. It was monarchy disguised as democracy, despotism wearing revolutionary rhetoric.
And yet, across Europe, many genuinely saw Napoleon as liberation, because the armies that conquered in his name did not simply impose French rule. They abolished feudalism, they emancipated Jews, they secularized government, they introduced legal equality, they dismantled the old regime's structures of privilege and hierarchy. In the Rhineland, in parts of Italy, in Poland, in the Netherlands, French conquest meant reform. Feudal dues were abolished, serfdom ended, guilds that restricted economic freedom were dissolved, the Code Napoleon replaced traditional law. For bourgeois merchants and professionals, for ambitious young men blocked by aristocratic privilege, for religious minorities, the French invasion meant opportunity. The liberation came with costs. French armies lived off the land, requisitioning food and supplies, impoverishing regions they occupied. Conscription took young men to die in Napoleon's wars. French commercial interests were privileged, dissent was crushed. This was empire, not liberation, but it was empire that destroyed old structures and created space for new possibilities.
The contradiction reached its peak in Spain. Napoleon invaded in 1808, overthrew the Spanish Bourbons, and installed his brother Joseph as king. French forces abolished the Inquisition, dissolved monasteries, enacted the Code Napoleon. These were reforms that Spanish liberals had long desired. But the Spanish people rose in rebellion, not because they opposed reform, but because they opposed foreign occupation. The guerrilla war that followed, the word guerrilla entered European languages from this conflict, was brutal and total. French troops faced ambushes, assassinations, popular resistance that made occupation impossible to sustain. Napoleon poured in reinforcements, eventually 300,000 soldiers. They controlled the cities, but not the countryside. The war drained French resources and morale. Spain revealed the limitation of revolution by conquest. You could not liberate people at gunpoint. Reform imposed by foreign armies, however enlightened, bred resentment rather than gratitude. Nationalism, the revolution's own creation, turned against the revolutionary empire. Because the revolution had taught peoples to think of themselves as nations with rights and sovereignty, the French proclaimed these principles. But when France invaded Germany, Italy, Spain, and imposed its rule, the conquered peoples demanded the same rights the French claimed. If the French nation had sovereignty, why not the German nation, the Italian nation, the Spanish nation? Napoleon had no good answer. He ruled an empire while proclaiming anti-imperial principles. He claimed popular sovereignty while imposing his will through military force. The contradiction could not be sustained indefinitely.
The Russian campaign of 1812 was the beginning of the end. Napoleon invaded with 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Russians retreated, refusing to give battle, burning their own cities rather than letting them supply the French. Napoleon reached Moscow to find it abandoned and set aflame. With winter approaching and no Russian surrender, he ordered retreat. The retreat became catastrophe. Cold, hunger, disease, and Cossack raids destroyed the Grand Army. Perhaps 50,000 soldiers made it back to France. Napoleon abandoned the army and raced back to Paris to suppress rumors of his death and organize new forces. But the myth of invincibility was shattered. The coalition formed against France, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, eventually joined by Britain. Napoleon won battles but could not win the war. He was fighting all of Europe with a France exhausted by 2 decades of conflict. In April 1814, Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba, a small Mediterranean island. The Bourbons were restored to the French throne. The European powers met at the Congress of Vienna to restore the old order, to erase the revolutionary decades, to ensure that nothing like this could happen again. But Napoleon was not finished. In March 1815, he escaped Elba and returned to France. The soldiers sent to arrest him joined him instead. Within 3 weeks, he had reclaimed power without firing a shot. The 100 days had begun. It ended at Waterloo on June 18, 1815. The British and Prussian armies defeated Napoleon decisively. He abdicated again and was exiled to St. Helena, a barren island in the South Atlantic where he would die in 1821. This time, there would be no return.
The Congress of Vienna tried to restore the world of 1789. Monarchies were reinstalled. Borders were redrawn to ignore national identities and favor dynastic claims. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods were treated as an aberration to be erased. But they could not erase the ideas. The Revolution had proclaimed that sovereignty came from the people, not from God or tradition. Napoleon had spread this principle across Europe, even while betraying it. Once people had glimpsed the possibility of equality before the law, of careers open to talent, of government accountable to the governed, they could not unsee it. The legal codes remained. The Napoleonic Code persisted in regions that had been under French control. The administrative reforms, rational territorial divisions, professional bureaucracies, centralized government, survived because they worked more efficiently than the chaotic systems they replaced. The emancipation of Jews in most of Western Europe persisted, though it would be contested. Most importantly, the idea of the nation persisted. People who had been subjects of dynastic empires, Germans, Italians, Poles, had glimpsed the possibility of national sovereignty. They had learned to think of themselves as peoples with collective identities and rights. This genie could not be put back in the bottle. Napoleon was many things: dictator, conqueror, reformer, propagandist, military genius, megalomaniac. But his most important historical role was as the vehicle through which revolutionary principles spread beyond France. He destroyed the old regime across much of Europe while building a personal empire. When the empire fell, the old regime could not be fully restored because too much had changed. As you settle towards sleep tonight, consider Napoleon's paradox. He was simultaneously the revolution's betrayer and its evangelist. He overthrew the Republic and crowned himself emperor. But he also spread the Code Napoleon, abolished feudalism across Europe, demonstrated that merit could trump birth, showed that modern institutions could replace medieval structures. Was he a revolutionary? Yes and no. He preserved some revolutionary achievements while destroying others. He spread revolutionary principles while establishing personal dictatorship. He proclaimed liberty while censoring the press. He spoke of equality while creating a new aristocracy. Perhaps the lesson is that revolutions rarely end cleanly, that their principles get incorporated into new systems that contradict them, that progress and reaction can coexist in the same regime, even the same person. Napoleon was not the revolution's natural conclusion. He was one possible outcome among many, an outcome that stabilized France, spread revolutionary ideas, and betrayed revolutionary ideals, all simultaneously. In our final chapter, we will trace the long echo of the revolution, how the ideas proclaimed in 1789 and spread by Napoleon's armies continued to reshape the world long after both the revolution and the empire had ended, how liberalism and nationalism and socialism all emerged from revolutionary soil, how the rights proclaimed in the Declaration became universal aspirations, how the revolution that seemed to fail ultimately succeeded in remaking humanity's political imagination. But that is tomorrow's story. Tonight, rest with the image of Napoleon on St. Helena, dying in exile, dictating memoirs that portrayed himself as the revolution's true defender. He was lying, of course, but like most effective lies, it contained enough truth to be believable. He had been the revolution's defender, just not in the way he claimed. He had defended it by spreading its principles even while betraying its spirit, by making its achievements permanent even while destroying its democratic forms. Sleep well. The empire is fallen, but its legacy endures. The Congress of Vienna ended in June 1815 with a grand ball celebrating the restoration of order. The diplomats who had spent months redrawing Europe's map danced in the same palace where Marie Antoinette had once held court.
The Bourbons sat on the French throne again. The old ruling families had reclaimed their kingdoms. The revolutionary decades seemed to be over, erased, consigned to history as a terrible aberration from which Europe had recovered. Prince Metternich, Austria's chief diplomat and the Congress's presiding genius, believed he had successfully restored the old order. He had created a system of monarchical solidarity, kings pledging to support each other against revolution, borders drawn to favor stability over national aspirations, repression coordinated internationally to prevent new outbreaks of radical unrest. But something had changed that no diplomatic settlement could reverse. The revolution had introduced ideas into the world that could not be unlearned. Once people had heard that sovereignty came from the people, that government required consent, that all men were created equal, those ideas persisted no matter how many thrones were restored or how many constitutions were torn up. The revolution had lost politically but won philosophically, and philosophical victories, though slower, prove more durable than military ones. Tonight, in our final chapter, we trace how the French Revolution's ideas spread across the globe and created the modern world, the world of nations and citizens, of rights and constitutions, of revolutions and reactions. We live inside the revolution's legacy, still arguing about the questions it raised, still working out the implications of principles it proclaimed. The first thing the revolution changed was how people understood political authority. Before 1789, legitimate government came from tradition, from divine right, from the natural hierarchy of things. Kings ruled because God ordained monarchy. Nobles governed because blood and breeding prepared them for leadership. This was not a political arrangement, but the natural order, as fixed as the seasons. The revolution shattered this. It declared that sovereignty resided in the nation, meaning the people collectively. Government existed to serve the people, not the reverse. When government failed in its duties, the people had the right to alter or abolish it. These principles were not new. They had roots in Enlightenment philosophy and American revolutionary thought, but proclaiming them in Europe's most powerful kingdom gave them revolutionary force. This changed everything. After 1789, no European monarch could claim absolute authority without challenge. Even when the Bourbons returned, they governed through a constitution, however limited. The language had shifted. Kings still reigned, but they increasingly had to justify their rule in terms of public good rather than divine sanction. Authority required legitimation, and legitimation increasingly meant some appeal to popular will, however constrained or manipulated. The nations that experienced French occupation learned these lessons directly. Germans, Italians, Poles who had lived under the Napoleonic Toad, who had seen feudalism abolished and legal equality proclaimed, could not simply return to the old regime. They had glimpsed alternatives. Many of the reforms were rolled back after 1815, but the knowledge that alternatives existed persisted.
Nationalism was the revolution's most powerful offspring. The revolution had proclaimed France a nation, not the king's domain, but the people's country. It had mobilized mass armies to defend the nation. It had made citizenship the basis of political identity, replacing the old patchwork of local, regional, and dynastic loyalties with a unified national consciousness. This model spread. Germans began to imagine a German nation, uniting the hundreds of principalities and kingdoms that made up German-speaking Europe. Italians imagined an Italian nation, freed from Austrian and papal rule. Poles dreamed of restoring a Polish nation that had been partitioned among empires. Greeks fought for independence from the Ottoman Empire in the name of Hellenic nationhood. Nationalism took both liberal and reactionary forms. Liberal nationalism imagined nations as communities of equal citizens, choosing their own governments, guaranteed basic rights. This was the nationalism of Mazzini in Italy, of the 1848 revolutionaries across Europe. Reactionary nationalism imagined nations as organic communities bound by blood and soil, requiring unity and hierarchy rather than rights and representation.
This was the nationalism that would eventually produce fascism. But both forms emerged from the same revolutionary source, the idea that peoples, not dynasties, were the fundamental units of political organization. This idea destabilized every multi-ethnic empire. If nations had the right to self-determination, then the Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman empires, which ruled dozens of different peoples, faced existential threats. The revolutions of 1848, though largely unsuccessful, revealed how deeply nationalist ideas had penetrated. And through the 19th and 20th centuries, those empires would indeed collapse, replaced by nation-states based on revolutionary principles. The revolutions of 1848 deserve particular attention. Beginning in France, where Parisians once again took to the barricades and overthrew another monarchy, revolutionary fervor spread across Europe. Within weeks, Vienna, Berlin, Milan, Venice, Budapest, and dozens of other cities erupted in revolution. The demands varied. Some wanted constitutions, some wanted national independence, some wanted democratic reforms, some wanted social revolution, but all shared the revolutionary legacy, the belief that peoples could change their political systems through collective action, that authority required consent, that the old regime was not inevitable. The revolutions of 1848 mostly failed. The armies rallied, the monarchies survived. The constitutions that were granted were often revoked or gutted. But the experience changed Europe. Millions of people had participated in politics for the first time. They had debated in clubs and published newspapers and elected representatives and fought on barricades. They had glimpsed the possibility of popular government. The failures of 1848 also taught lessons about revolution. Many radicals concluded that spontaneous popular uprisings were insufficient, that successful revolution required organization and discipline, the lessons that would inform socialist and communist movements. Others concluded that reform through gradual pressure was more effective than revolutionary rupture. Both conclusions emerged from reflecting on why the French Revolution's promise had not been fully realized.
Liberalism emerged directly from revolutionary soil. The term liberal, in its political sense, was coined during the Spanish resistance to Napoleon, but it described principles that the revolution had proclaimed: constitutional government, separation of powers, protection of individual rights, rule of law, limited government, representative institutions. Throughout the 19th century, liberals across Europe fought for these principles. They wanted constitutions that limited monarchical power. They wanted parliaments elected by propertied citizens. They wanted freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion. They wanted legal equality and careers open to talent. They wanted rational administration and modern economic policies. These were revolutionary demands in monarchical Europe. Liberals were often censored, exiled, imprisoned. Metternich's system identified liberalism as revolution's heir and suppressed it accordingly, but liberal ideas spread nonetheless, through books, through exile communities, through the concrete examples of Britain and America, where constitutional government seemed to produce both liberty and prosperity. By the late 19th century, most European countries had constitutions and parliaments, however limited their powers. Liberalism had won significant victories, but it had also revealed its limitations. Liberal constitutions often granted rights only to propertied men, excluding workers and all women. Liberal economics produced growing inequality. Liberal rationalism seemed blind to the appeals of tradition, community, and belonging that nationalism and religion provided. These limitations gave rise to socialism, another revolutionary offspring.
Socialism emerged from the recognition that the revolution had proclaimed equality, but produced a new hierarchy of wealth. The Declaration of the Rights of Man spoke of equal rights, but in practice, the bourgeoisie, who owned property, had vastly more power than workers who sold their labor. The revolution had destroyed feudal privilege, but created capitalist exploitation. It had abolished the aristocracy of birth, but created an aristocracy of wealth.
The early socialists, St. Simon, Fourier, Owen, proposed alternative social organizations, communes, cooperatives, rational planning. They believed society could be reorganized to eliminate poverty and inequality while preserving liberty. They were utopians designing perfect societies on paper. Then came Marx and Engels, who transformed socialism from utopian dreaming to revolutionary program. They argued that capitalism, like feudalism before it, would be overthrown by its own internal contradictions. The working class, organized and conscious, would seize power and create a classless society. This would be the revolution that finally realized 1789's promises: true equality, true freedom, true fraternity. Marxist socialism claimed the revolutionary mantle explicitly. Marx saw the French Revolution as the bourgeois revolution, necessary to overthrow feudalism, but insufficient to achieve real equality. The proletarian revolution would complete what 1789 had begun. It would abolish not just feudal privilege, but all class distinctions, creating a society where the Declaration's principles would finally be realized. The early socialists, St. Simon, Fourier, Owen, proposed alternative social organizations, communes, cooperatives, rational planning. They believed society could be reorganized to eliminate poverty and inequality while preserving liberty. They were utopians designing perfect societies on paper. Then came Marx and Engels, who transformed socialism from utopian dreaming to revolutionary program. They argued that capitalism, like feudalism before it, would be overthrown by its own internal contradictions. The working class, organized and conscious, would seize power and create a classless society. This would be the revolution that finally realized 1789's promises: true equality, true freedom, true fraternity. Marxist socialism claimed the revolutionary mantle explicitly. Marx saw the French Revolution as the bourgeois revolution, necessary to overthrow feudalism, but insufficient to achieve real equality. The proletarian revolution would complete what 1789 had begun. It would abolish not just feudal privilege, but all class distinctions, creating a society where the Declaration's principles would finally be realized.
The socialist movements that developed in the late 19th century, trade unions, labor parties, revolutionary cells, all traced their lineage to the French Revolution. They sang the Marseillaise, they commemorated Bastille Day, they studied the Jacobins in the Paris Commune. They saw themselves as heirs to the revolutionary tradition, completing the unfinished work of 1789. The revolution also transformed how people thought about rights. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was not the first rights document. The American Declaration of Independence preceded it, and English traditions of rights went back centuries. But the French Declaration made rights universal and inherent, rather than particular and granted. This universalism would have profound consequences. If rights were truly universal, belonging to all humans simply by virtue of being human, then they applied to everyone, everywhere, not just French citizens, not just men, everyone. The revolutionaries themselves did not fully accept this logic. The Declaration spoke of men, and they meant adult males with property. When Olympe de Gouges published the Declaration of the Rights of Woman in 1791, demanding that women receive the same rights proclaimed for men, she was mocked and eventually guillotined, for other reasons, but her feminism didn't help. When Haiti's enslaved people revolted in 1791, using the Declaration's language to demand freedom, many French revolutionaries were horrified. Rights were not meant for black people or colonial subjects. But once universal rights were proclaimed, they could not be limited indefinitely. Women's movements in the 19th and 20th centuries appealed to the Declaration's principles. Anti-colonial movements cited the right to self-determination. Civil rights movements demanded equality proclaimed but not delivered. The gap between principle and practice became a permanent source of political struggle. The Declaration created a vocabulary and framework for making rights claims.
Every subsequent movement for equality, for workers, for women, for racial minorities, for colonized peoples, for sexual minorities, has used language and concepts that trace to the revolutionary proclamation that all humans have inherent rights and equal dignity. The revolution changed how people thought about time and progress. Before 1789, most Europeans understood time cyclically or through Christian eschatology. History might go in circles, or it might lead to apocalypse and salvation, but it did not necessarily improve. The idea of inevitable progress was not widespread. The revolution introduced the idea of rupture, that human action could fundamentally alter the course of history, that old orders could be overthrown and new ones created, that the future could be radically different from and better than the past. The revolutionary calendar, starting time over at year 1, expressed this perfectly. We can remake time itself. This idea of revolutionary transformation spread globally. 19th century revolutionaries across Europe, Latin America, and eventually Asia spoke of breaking with the past and creating new societies. The October Revolution in Russia explicitly modeled itself on the French Revolution. The Chinese Revolution invoked similar themes. Anti-colonial movements spoke of national rebirth after the death of colonial subjection.
The belief that societies could and should be consciously remade according to rational principles, for better or worse, is a revolutionary legacy. It informed liberal reform movements, socialist planning, and even reactionary modernization efforts. The 20th century's great ideological conflicts, liberalism versus fascism versus communism, all involved competing visions of how to remake society, all assuming that society could be remade. The revolution also demonstrated the dangers of revolutionary politics. The terror showed how ideological purity could produce mass violence, how emergency powers could become permanent, how virtue could justify atrocity. These lessons were not always learned. Every subsequent revolution faced the same questions. How do you consolidate power without becoming tyrannical? How do you eliminate opposition without descending into terror? How do you transform society without destroying it? The answers varied, but the questions were set by the French experience. The Russian Revolution repeated many of the French Revolution's patterns: the initial moderate phase, the radicalization, the terror, the dictator who claimed to embody revolutionary principles. The Chinese Revolution followed similar dynamics. So did many anti-colonial revolutions. The cycle seemed almost inevitable: revolutionary enthusiasm, fragmentation, radicalization, terror, authoritarian consolidation. But the revolution also provided models for avoiding these patterns. The failures of 1793-94 taught that democracy required institutions that could survive disagreement, that rights needed protection from temporary majorities, that power required checks and balances. These lessons informed the more successful democratic transitions, the gradual expansion of suffrage in Britain, the reconstruction of Europe after World War II, the democratic transitions in post-Franco Spain and post-communist Eastern Europe. Perhaps the revolution's deepest legacy is the belief that the political order is not natural or inevitable, but human-made and therefore changeable. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary in 1789. For most of human history, most people accepted that the social order they were born into was fixed, ordained by God or nature or tradition. Kings ruled because that was how the world worked. Nobles were noble because bloodlines mattered. Inequality was natural. The revolution shattered this assumption. It demonstrated that ordinary people, organized and determined, could overthrow kings and remake society. The demonstration was imperfect. The revolution devoured itself, ended in dictatorship, spread through conquest, but the demonstration had been made. It could not be unmade. Every movement for change since, every demand for democracy, every assertion of rights, every struggle against oppression stands on the foundation the revolution created. When people march for justice, they are channeling revolutionary energy. When they demand that government serve the people rather than the reverse, they are applying revolutionary principles. When they insist that birth and wealth should not determine destiny, they are echoing revolutionary ideals. The revolution did not create a perfect world. It did not even create a good world in France during its most radical phase. But it created the possibility of imagining better worlds. It gave people language and concepts for demanding change. It demonstrated that structures of power that seemed eternal could collapse when enough people decided they were intolerable.
We live in the world the revolution made. Our political vocabulary, left and right, liberal and conservative, citizen and rights, nation and republic, comes from the revolution. Our assumptions about legitimate government, that it requires consent, that it should protect rights, that it should treat people equally before the law, trace to revolutionary proclamations. Our belief that we can and should consciously shape our political future rather than simply accepting what tradition gives us is a revolutionary inheritance. The revolution's shadow side is also with us. The terror demonstrated how ideological certainty produces violence. Napoleon showed how revolution can produce dictatorship. The revolution's failures revealed how difficult it is to build free societies, how easily revolutionary enthusiasm turns to tyranny, how the gap between proclaimed principles and actual practice creates endless conflict. We are still arguing about the revolution's questions. What rights do people have? Who counts as part of the people? When does government lose legitimacy? What justifies revolutionary action? How do we balance liberty and equality? How do we reconcile universal principles with particular identities? These questions have no permanent answers. Each generation must answer them anew in their own circumstances. As you drift towards sleep tonight, on this final night of our journey through the revolution, consider how thoroughly it has shaped your world. The fact that you can vote, that you have rights a government cannot simply revoke, that laws apply equally regardless of birth, that you can practice your religion or none at all, that careers are, in theory, open to talent rather than bloodline. All of these trace to revolutionary principles. The fact that you can imagine a different political system, that you can criticize your government without being arrested, in most places, that you think of yourself as a citizen rather than a subject, these too are revolutionary inheritances. The revolution did not create heaven on earth. It created a different kind of hell during the terror. It ended in dictatorship and empire, but it also proclaimed principles that could not be fully suppressed, that all humans have dignity and rights, that government requires consent, that peoples can choose their own destinies. These ideas are not self-executing. They do not automatically produce justice or freedom or equality. They create possibilities and frameworks. What we do with them is up to us. The revolution is not over because the questions it raised are still being answered. The principles it proclaimed are still being contested. The work it began is still unfinished. Every time someone stands up to power and demands justice, they are channeling revolutionary spirit. Every time a movement proclaims universal rights, they are applying revolutionary logic. Every time people organize to change their political system, they are following revolutionary example. The revolution changed humanity forever by demonstrating that humans could change themselves, that the world was not fixed, that different futures were possible. This knowledge, once gained, cannot be lost. We carry it forward into an uncertain future, still arguing about what it means, still working out its implications, still trying to realize the promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The revolution is dead. Long live the revolution. Sleep now, citizen. Tomorrow you wake in the world the revolution made, a world still shaped by ideas proclaimed in 1789, still struggling with contradictions the revolutionaries could not resolve, still reaching toward promises they articulated but could not fulfill.
The storming of the Bastille, the Declaration of Rights, the execution of the king, the terror, Napoleon's empire, all of it is history now, distant events studied in books. But the ideas those events carried into the world remain alive, contested, powerful. You are the revolution's inheritors. What you do with that inheritance is not predetermined. The revolution gave you tools, concepts, and language and examples, but not a map. The future remains open, still being written, still subject to human choice and action. Rest well, knowing that change is possible, that the structures that seem permanent are human creations, that peoples have power when they choose to exercise it. The revolution proved this. For better and worse, it proved this. The revolution is over. Its work continues. Tomorrow, you continue it.